Imagine standing at the edge of the known world in 1772, staring into a grey abyss where the ocean and sky dissolve into one. The air bites at your skin like iron. The water around you is not water anymore. It is a churning field of ice, groaning and cracking, stretching as far as any human eye has ever seen. You are further south than any person in recorded history has ever stood. And the man who brought you here, James Cook, is about to prove that everyone before him was wrong about what lies beyond this frozen wall. This is the story of James Cook's second voyage, a 3-year odyssey from 1772 to 1775 that shattered every assumption about the bottom of the world. It was not a voyage of triumph in the conventional sense. Cook found no great southern continent teeming with riches and millions of inhabitants. What he found instead was something arguably more important, the truth. And the truth, in this case, was a vast, frozen, merciless emptiness that would humble the ambitions of an entire civilization. The obsession that drove Cook southward had deep roots. For centuries, European philosophers and geographers had insisted that a massive landmass must exist in the southern hemisphere. The logic seemed sound enough. If great continents existed in the north, surely balance demanded equivalent weight in the south. They called it Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land, and they populated it in their imaginations with tens of millions of inhabitants and inexhaustible wealth. The Scottish geographer Alexander Dalrymple had argued passionately that this continent's trade alone would be enough to sustain the entire power of Britain. Men built careers and reputations on its existence. Empires drew it on their maps. Cook's first voyage, aboard HMS Endeavour from 1768 to 1771, had already begun to chip away at this fantasy. He had charted New Zealand, reached the eastern coast of Australia, and found no sign of the mythical supercontinent. Yet the true believers were not satisfied. The southern continent, they insisted, lay further south, beyond where Cook had ventured. And so the Admiralty sent him back. This time, Cook commanded 2 vessels purpose-built for endurance in brutal conditions, HMS Resolution and HMS Adventure. The Resolution was Cook's flagship, a sturdy, converted Whitby collier in the tradition of the Endeavour, chosen for the same qualities that made such vessels invaluable: a flat bottom, a broad bow, and a deep hold capable of carrying months of provisions. These were not glamorous warships. They were workhorses designed to survive. The expedition departed from Plymouth in July 1772, carrying with it some of the finest scientific minds Britain could assemble. Alongside Cook sailed the astronomer William Wales aboard Resolution and William Bailey aboard Adventure, tasked with testing the new marine chronometers that promised to solve the centuries-old problem of calculating longitude at sea. The naturalist Johann Reinhold Forster and his son Georg came aboard to document the natural world they encountered. These men were not merely passengers. They were the instruments through which an age of enlightenment would attempt to measure and comprehend the unknown. The mechanism of the voyage itself was a masterpiece of planning and brutal improvisation. Cook drove his ship southward in great sweeping arcs, crossing and recrossing the Southern Ocean in a methodical search pattern designed to either find land or prove its absence. The ships fought through storms that modern sailors still regard with awe. Waves the height of houses crashed over the decks. Rigging froze solid. The men worked with hands so cold they could barely grip the lines. Ice appeared first as scattered fragments, then as towering bogs that dwarfed the ships themselves, cathedral-like structures of blue and white that could crush a wooden hull in seconds. On the 17th of January, 1773, Cook achieved something no human being had ever done before. HMS Resolution and HMS Adventure crossed the Antarctic Circle, pushing past 66 degrees 33 minutes south latitude. They sailed into a realm that had existed beyond the reach of human experience since the beginning of time. The crew stared at the ice in a mixture of wonder and dread. There was no land. There was no continent waiting to reward their suffering. There was only the ice, and the cold, and the silence. Cook crossed the Antarctic Circle not once, but 3 times during the voyage. On his furthest southern penetration, he reached approximately 71 degrees 10 minutes south, a record that would stand for nearly 50 years. Each time, the ice turned him back before he could sight the continent that does, in fact, lie beyond it. The Antarctic continent exists. Cook simply never saw it. He came within perhaps 100 miles of its coastline, separated from one of history's great discoveries by a wall of pack ice that his wooden ships could not penetrate. The separation of the 2 ships during a storm in the Southern Ocean in February 1773 added another layer of danger to the enterprise. Resolution and Adventure lost contact with each other and would not reunite until they reached Queen Charlotte Sound in New Zealand months later. The Adventure, under the command of Tobias Furneaux, would eventually be forced to return to England separately, carrying with her the terrible news that 10 of her crew had been killed and reportedly cannibalized by Maori at Grass Cove in New Zealand, an incident that darkened the final chapters of the voyage with grief and moral complexity. Cook himself was not an easy man to serve under. He was demanding, precise, and utterly relentless in his pursuit of the voyage's objectives. Yet he was also, by the standards of his era, remarkably attentive to his crew's welfare. He enforced the consumption of sauerkraut and other antiscorbutic foods with the same iron will he applied to navigation, understanding that scurvy, the great killer of long voyages, could be defeated through diet. The result was extraordinary. Across 3 years and tens of thousands of miles, Cook did not lose a single man to scurvy. This alone was a revolution in naval medicine. Among the lesser-known dimensions of the voyage was its contribution to the science of longitude. The chronometers tested by Wales and Bailey performed beyond expectation, proving that accurate timekeeping could solve one of navigation's oldest problems. The data collected by the Forsters on wildlife, botany, and indigenous peoples across the Pacific Islands, New Zealand, and the subantarctic regions filled volumes and shaped the emerging science of natural history. Cook's charts of the Southern Ocean were so accurate that they would guide mariners for generations. Cook returned to England in July 1775 and delivered his verdict on the southern continent in language that carries a quiet, devastating authority. He concluded that if a continent existed beyond the ice, it lay so far south and was so thoroughly locked in frozen desolation that it would never be of any use to humanity. He had not disproved the existence of Antarctica. He had simply made it irrelevant to the dreams of empire. The fantasy was over. And yet, in the deepest philosophical sense, what Cook's second voyage reveals is something far more interesting than the absence of a continent. It reveals the extraordinary human capacity to push into the unknown not because reward is guaranteed, but because the question demands an answer. Cook and his men endured conditions of almost incomprehensible hardship. The cold, the isolation, the storms, the psychological weight of sailing into waters where no help could reach them, driven by a commitment to empirical truth that defines the best of the Enlightenment spirit. The voyage also raises uncomfortable questions about what exploration means. The same ships that crossed the Antarctic Circle also called at Pacific Islands, and those encounters were not always peaceful or equal. The broader age of exploration that Cook embodied set in motion processes of colonization and cultural disruption, whose consequences are still being reckoned with today. Cook himself was not a simple hero. He was a man of his time, brilliant and flawed, serving an empire whose ambitions extended far beyond the pursuit of knowledge. Today, the Antarctic continent that Cook nearly reached is the subject of international scientific cooperation and environmental urgency. The Antarctic Treaty of 1959 designated the continent as a zone of peace and science, a direct descendant of the spirit of inquiry that sent Cook southward in the first place. Climate scientists now work in the very waters Cook sailed, measuring the retreat of ice shelves and the warming of the Southern Ocean, changes that will affect every coastline on Earth. The lessons of Cook's second voyage are not simply historical. They speak to what humanity does when it confronts the edge of the known, whether it retreats into comfortable myth or presses forward into uncomfortable truth. Cook pressed forward. He found not the paradise of Dalrymple's imagination, but something more valuable, an honest map of the world as it actually is. In an age drowning in misinformation and wishful thinking, that particular form of courage feels more necessary than ever. The ice is still out there. The question is whether we still have the will to face it.